Hi, everyone. Firstly, I wanted to thank you all for taking the time to talk to us today. It's been incredibly informative. Oh, here you are. I see you. Thanks, Kyle. So your question was, can you elaborate on the model? This is for Grace. Can you elaborate on the model by which you developed your co-housing project, limited equity rental model? Further, could you discuss the planning environment in your context and discuss whether or not zoning restrictions contribute to your capacity to produce affordable or co-housing effectively?
So let's see, breaking that down a little bit. The model that we developed our project, we intentionally did not do a standard or traditional co-housing model where everybody bought their own single family homes, or in our case, a condo or a strata. We decided early on that we wanted to be welcoming of people of all economic backgrounds. And so we made up our own model, which is not something I would actually recommend. It was not, that was the biggest challenge for us. The zoning didn't have any implications. We bought a piece of property that we knew was could be developed as multifamily housing. From the city standpoint, from a land use standpoint, there's nothing that precludes us from building co-housing specifically, because co-housing is just it's a social model. It's not a legal model or a physical structure model. So I think our biggest challenge was really from the standpoint of how do we make up a legal entity and a method or means to buy into our community, buy in a legal way and financial way that would be set low enough that it wasn't a complete barrier for the families that we had involved or new families that were going to be coming in. But that it also was something that could be defined and described from a legal standpoint in terms of creating a set of operating bylaws and operating agreements and things like that. So I will say that we are not the most cost effective. If you look at our actual rents, it's not, I wouldn't say that we are affordable. We are affordable for our neighborhood. We live in one of the most expensive places in Seattle, and Seattle is one of the most expensive cities in the nation. But what we have created is a sustainable, a stable housing situation for all of the residents that live here. And it flies in the face of anything that is normal in capitalistic terms of home ownership or home sales. Nobody outside of our community gets it. They don't understand the banks and the attorneys. None of them understood why we wouldn't want to make the most money possible on our real estate investment. So that was a little challenging.
Thank you. Thanks for elaborating.
Hey, Kyle, I know you have a second question. I'm going to go through to Elizabeth first, and then I'll circle around if we have time to your second question. So Elizabeth, you can turn your video on also if you like, but no pressure. I know we're all sort of, oh, there you are. Hi. Do you want to ask it, your first question?
Sure. I'm going to unmute myself there. Let me just read it. So yeah, again, thanks everyone for talking. And so my first question comes from my own experiences living in co-housing situations, where basically we had agreements within because of the networks we had set up in our co-housing situations that we basically had like no police rules in our houses. So my question is, in my experience, co-housing encourages social solidarity between the neighbors, especially in the light of the protests right now, which are calling to defund and abolish the police. How can co-housing work to build neighborhood solidarity and render police power obsolete? So I don't know if someone wants to answer that question, or I mean, I also just have my own experience to share. So.
I can just share really quickly our experience, kind of what's happening with him right now, with the protests happening literally outside of our doors. There are definitely people, and this doesn't come up because of the protests, but it has come up in general. There's a lot of people who work in social justice, that work with children in the education system that are not the typical students from the standpoint they are mostly kids of color that are in sort of alternative high schools. So there's definitely a resistance. It goes both ways. We also live in an urban neighborhood, so we've had trespassers, people just like hopping the fence or hopping the rooftop parapet to get into our property. And how on one side, there are people in the community, the very same people that want to have our building as sort of a protected home so that people feel safe to leave their doors unlocked, to let their kids walk around unsupervised in our building. And on the flip side, a reaction of, we had somebody trespass a couple weeks ago where they popped over the fence and somebody went upstairs and called them out on it. And the same people that want to have our building protected and safe and all that also don't want us to call the police. And so, holding that intention, I think in light of everything that's going on, I think there's definitely, I don't know about solidarity, there's a uniform of feeling in the building that everybody is in support of the protests, in support of dismantling racism, and very much aware of these, these are conversations that we have regularly. And yet I'm not sure that I could say that the whole building would say that we want to render the police power obsolete. I think that the institutional racism inherent in the police, in all of our governmental institutions, I think is something that we all agree in our community that we need to work on. And I would also say there's at least a handful, if not more, the majority, that believe that there is a positive role that the police have to play in our communities. The negative right now completely outweigh and shadow anything that's positive right now, understandably. So I think this is a difficult question to ask. And I would say that our view is probably different than any community. I think every community is going to have their own, co-housing community is going to have their own response to that. And I also want to clarify, Elizabeth, you said you lived in co-housing situations, but are you talking about co-housing or are you talking about co-living shared houses? I just want to make that distinction.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, not co-housing in the sense of like a bunch of people going in like economically to this project together. So yeah, more definite co-living, but sharing some of the principles of the co-housing situations where you set up these kind of like rules of how you're going to live together that make it different than just like, like a roommate scenario where you're just living with a lot of different people. It's somewhere in between the two.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. I asked that specifically because there's so many people conflating co-housing and co-living in other intentional communities, which I am not discrediting or anything, but it's important to me to make sure to draw that distinction because there's so much conflation that's happening.
Grace, how do you define them? Can you give us the breakdown of those different categories?
I can't do the whole breakdown. I could probably do more, but I will say the distinction between co-housing and co-living is that co-living is essentially a shared household, and in the current modern day version of that, it looks like a large apartment building where people only have exclusive occupation of usually their room and maybe a bathroom, and that the rest of the facilities are shared. It often is targeted towards younger folks, single folks, and it's not to say that there's not couples or older people living in those communities, but it's very short tenure. When I look at, when talking to people that are operating these and looking at who lives there, it tends to be short term. I think the average stay is about 14 months or something like that. Whereas co-housing is usually you're occupying your own home, whether it's an apartment or a single family house or duplex. You have the whole, you have everything that you would have in a standalone kind of living situation. And it's really geared towards long tenure. I think the tenureship is probably the biggest difference. I will say you can have co-living situations in co-housing, meaning like a couple of houses or multiple houses could be a co-living situation where there's multiple people that might come in and out to help reduce the cost of living in co-housing. But I would say that it's not a given that all co-living situations are co-housing.
Grace, you could also say that co-living in its modern form is kind of corporate, where they have these big corporations that are buying spaces and then renting them out to people.
And usually to people of higher incomes, at least in the urban neighborhoods that we are living in.
So does that answer your, oh, sorry, Adrian, were you gonna add on to that?
I just wanted to say, Elizabeth, could you share your story about policing?
Sure. And I mean, it's less specifically my story. And I mean, it kind of goes to what Crystal was saying, that when you live in a housing community that is more diverse, you become used to that diverse community. And so, I mean, like, in general, like I would say I lived in 2 different housing situations that reflect this, where there were many of us sharing, again, not really a roommate situation, but more of like a collective living situation, where, you know, most of us were queer people, a lot of us were trans people, a lot of us were undocumented workers, people who had previous history with the police, maybe, who basically, there were reasons why we didn't want the police to come to our buildings. And another thing also, I mean, like with these kind of collective buildings, is that they do, because they often have amenities, often there'll be event spaces, they'll have garden spaces, there'll be a lot of people coming in and out of these places, and that invites often police presence. You know, if there's events happening, there might be a noise complaint. So like the chance of getting the police coming to your door, and then it's like, well, what is as a community, what is our decision about what happens when, like, you know, is there a rule that someone in the house is the person who speaks to the police? Is there a rule that no one speaks to? It's just like, how do you decide as a community what to do in those situations? Which is just, again, it's something that not everyone would think about. You know, not everyone knows that there are people who shouldn't have to speak to the police, or that it's dangerous for them to speak to the police. And just, yeah, and then how can you support yourselves in your household? So like if something bad does happen in your household, how do you as a family network take care of each other and make sure that you can all stay safe? And it is just something you have to decide with this co-living situation. And it depends who you're living with. And yeah, I think it's important to understand that the way that communities like that interact with the rest of the city or the rest of their community is maybe different than just like a single family household would communicate with the police and those other, you know, social services.
And I would say that, I mean, that's a very specific example that you're talking about with the interactions with the police, but I can extrapolate that to lots of other decisions that get made in our building. Just recently with the COVID, it's like we had to make a specific decision that we are going to lock down our building, and nobody that does not live in the building can enter, just in order to keep everybody safe. So, and all of these kinds of things are community decisions, that it's not universal that every community is going to have the same agreements or that they're going to have the same values. So I think better understanding your question, I would say in general, every community has their own set of values and principles. Often they're espoused on their websites, and how they choose to live those and how they choose to hold each other accountable and have those conversations are really independent or specific to that community. I would say that we are probably oversharers in my community in terms of talking about lots of things. Having just hosted something on the National CoHousing Conference last weekend, I will say, you know, compared to larger communities that have individual homes spread out on large pieces of property, who are not talking about these things explicitly, not communicating, and having judgment about other people's behavior. Our community has been much more proactive in talking about these things early on and making sure that we're on the same page. And if we aren't on the same page, respecting that difference and then figuring out a way that we can develop guidelines or protocols that we all feel comfortable with, so that nobody feels unsafe or unheard.
So do you imagine, Grace, that there would be spaces that would be dedicated for community accountability or transformative justice?
Are you talking about physical space or just? Okay.
I'm thinking that how do we as architects start to sort of bring those into our designs or make those considerations when we're thinking about, you know, community responsibility and accountability to one another?
I think it's hard to, for me, it's really engaging the people that you're working with. I think as much as we might want to impose our personal beliefs and values, if that community is not receptive to that idea, we all have to remember that as architects, we are a service profession. We don't do things at the behest of a patron or a benefactor. We usually have somebody that is paying us in a different way for a service, and usually those services tend to be transactional. So I think if there is a like-minded client that desires those things, or if as you're talking with them through programming, it becomes clear that they want those things, then I think it can be, I definitely think that there could be physical spaces to allow for that. But I think it's really hard for me to imagine kind of talking to a bunch of students to say, in theory, it would be, you know, that you can do these things. I think it's really, you have to remember that co-housing is a physical structure. It's a building, ultimately, or buildings, and somebody's paying for them. And so most people are not, even with the most idealistic intent, and I will say I put myself into that category, with all these lofty aspirations of what we're trying to do and achieve, at the end of the day, we also all want to live in community. So if there is large amounts of space that are dedicated to things that are really to serve the outside, and there's no means to fund those outside activities occupying that space, it's really hard to justify dedicating 200 or 500 or 1,000 square feet for people to come in and do restorative work in our space. Not to say that the common can't be the venue for that activity, and oftentimes common houses designed well can accommodate all sorts of community activities. So I'm not trying to be a wet blanket, but I'm also trying to like layer in the dose of reality and the realities of finances. At the end of the day, it's not a theoretical endeavor. We all want to physically be together, housed and protected and able to have these conversations real time.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say that what she's talking about is like the values of the people who are building the community. And, you know, it's the people who are interested in co-housing are usually going to be middle class, upper class, older and white. And so they're going to have those values that say the police are people who keep us safe. You know, they may not have heard of transformative or restorative justice. So those values, and since they're the ones with the money to actually build co-housing, that's what they're gonna build with. And the other thing I wanted to say is that there are communities of minorities where, you know, there's an agreement that we don't call the police. But when you have mixed communities, mixed races, you have a lot more of the white families seeing the police as like that protector, those people who keep us safe. And so it's harder when you have a mixed community to say, as we're to all agree that we're not going to call the police, because there is a tendency for white people to think, okay, this person might be hurting me and I need a way to feel safe.
Okay, so the next order of questions is I'm going to invite Sally, who's put up her hand patiently. And Sally, I assume you'll turn on your audio and video and ask a question, and then we'll move on to Val.
Okay, 1 second. Let me just figure out how to, okay. All right, hi, sorry, I'm a little bit dark because I'm like right in front of a window. I'm also coming to you guys from Seattle, like Grace. I actually, yeah, I'm a designer here, and the protests have been going on like just a few minutes drive from where I live, so it's been very relevant as to like all the thoughts that have been going on my mind, and everything that's going on in the States just feels, just because it's so close to my front door, especially, it feels just so powerful, and it's like definitely dominating just how I'm approaching my day to day. I have a question for Crystal in particular. Like growing up because I grew up in Toronto in Canada, and growing up in an Asian American household, like I understand that like I was born in Korea, and like most of my family, they still live in Korea, and like it's a very homogenous country. So for family members who grew up in that kind of society, like how there's always been a clash between me who grew up like learning like Canadian values and like from my friends and my peers, but with my family hearing completely different opinions, especially when it comes to addressing other minorities, especially like Black communities, Black Canadians, Black Americans, and like how they see them as just a very preconceived notion that they've always had growing up because it was such a homogenous society. And so like everything that's going on is just sparking this like need for me to talk about this with them, like in my head, just but how can I go about approaching that, like talking to these family members who understandably grew up in a different time, different cultural setting, and without feeling like I'm attacking them and saying that everything you grew up knowing is wrong, like just not saying it in that way, but how can I just begin that conversation and just let them know like this is the time we live in, like we need to talk about this, we need to change how this is being talked about among you guys, like with other Koreans, like other minorities, like how can we go about that when we know that they have a very different experience?
Thanks. Yeah, there's different stages of kind of awareness of racism, of how other people operate in the world. So I think when you have people who are kind of already like they have a viewpoint and they believe that viewpoint and they're set in their ways, it's really important just to listen to them, to ask them questions like, okay, what do you think about what's going on with the protests? What do you think they're protesting? What do you think are their values? You could ask them, have they ever felt like their race or their ethnicity as Koreans ever caused a problem in how they were living in Canada? You can use media like watching 13th the documentary or reading books. And it's not to sit them down and say, now I'm going to educate you. It's to say, let's have a conversation. And the biggest thing that you have to do is kind of like hold your tongue. And instead of like jumping in and like saying, but this and this and this and this, just listen to them. Because when they feel like they're being heard, they'll be more open to what you have to say. And so once they're in that kind of pattern with you where you're listening to them and they're talking about it, you can start saying, well, now I have seen some of the experiences of people. I've been hearing about this and, telling them about it, and then just having that conversation back and forth on what's going on. You're not going to change their mind, immediately or even like in a short period of time. It's just an ongoing conversation of helping them to see the viewpoint of others and to respect that viewpoint. They may not ever agree with protesting or whatever's going on, but they can see like, okay, I understand more of the background, the history, and why it's happening.
I'll also add in, and hopefully this is not taken the wrong way, but I can relate to that, to your experience, being a Korean American, having been born in Korea, but moving here when I was 3. And so very much an American in that way, and trying to explain some concepts to my parents. We've been watching Kim's Convenience, which is a Toronto-based sitcom. And the 2020 series has been interesting. They've been touching a lot on race and unconscious bias and things like that. And so I could imagine like watching one of those shows with my parents and kind of gauging their reaction to it. I think for them to see somebody that looks like them, that acts and talks like them, addressing these things and taking both sides is a really healthy way for them to feel like, oh, this isn't a other person's problem or a white person's problem. Like this is something that I, in my community, can talk about, and I see other people talking about them. It might be a gateway into the conversation, as opposed to an academic conversation that is really difficult to engage in. My parents just shut down whenever I try to bring this up in another way.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Thank you so much. I do have another question, but I'll wait until if we have time later.
Okay, thanks, Sally. So Val, I'm gonna give you the floor if it's a question you want to ask. And we are sort of, gearing up to closing off the symposium. So
Sure.
If you keep it short, then maybe we can finish off with one more question. So thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Grace. Thank you, Crystal, Adrian, John. Thank you, Victoria, for all of this. Grace, I want to say that I start my co-housing studio over the last 2 years with your TED recordings because it's the best introduction into the, for students, also for students coming from somewhere else, from other countries and from other parts of Canada. This is the master's intake. That said, I'm the problem I've had with a lot of the co-housing discussion is that, and my memory goes back to when I was doing nonprofit housing in the 1980s when it was still being funded, co-op housing in Canada, in Ontario, is that there always seemed to be, as Crystal very, very accurately pointed out, a very strong activist base. At times it was low income, but it was hardly diverse, even for Canada, which does have a great official respect for diversity in that kind of, in any kind of activity. It seems to me that there were always a small number of alternative housing options, even with co-housing, which was funded by the government as a fairly big program that produced a lot of stuff. With an activist base, you are limited, and your impact societally is quite limited. If you want to really have an impact, it seems that you have to somehow address the market and also address the kind of the expectations, the variations on type. All of the housing that I've seen in co-housing seems to be this 3 to 4 story place with a very kind of sincere activist group that started it. And it doesn't give you much of an entry into dealing with everybody. And I'm wondering, is that a problem? Is that a core problem, or is it resolvable? I want to ask both of you. Grace, I suppose you might as well. You're the one who showed architecture.
I'll be brief in my, so I would say on the spectrum of intentional communities, co-housing tends to be the most kind of mainstream. So in terms of, I would say that there's lots of folks in co-housing that are grassroots activists. Even Katie McCammett, who's one of the founders, was an organizer in her early career. So I think that co-housing tends to attract sort of social activists, social justice oriented people. And because it's all a bunch of like lay people, I'll say that from the standpoint of non-architect, building, construction related people, they are working in the construct of how does housing development get done in North America today. And I would also say that there's also some that are attracted to co-housing just for the way of life, not the more philosophical social justice values or whatever values the community has. And so I would say that I don't know that co-housing is sort of the crucible for answering that question. I think that you did ask in your written question also like how you might be exclusive of others because of having a singular focus. I think that tends to happen with all types of communities, but I think it's yeah, I'll sort of leave it with that. Is like I think there are co-housing activists. We are not the most extreme, and I would say even in my community, there's quite a range of those who feel very strongly about various social issues and what they are willing to do along those lines, versus others that are aware of it and maybe want to migrate closer, but might not be the ones to take to the streets and actively lay down their bodies on the front lines.
Yeah, but is there actually a chance to turn this into a kind of a mass market? I mean, condominiums, urban condominiums are a mass market. Suburban houses are a mass market. The two polar opposites. There's a lot in between. But is this doable for everybody just as a kind of mass thing, or is this always sort of in this smaller ecosystem?
I think if we
social ecosystem.
So I am a firm believer and idealist and hoping that co-housing can become a much more accessible to the broader public kind of housing model. And I think that also means moving away from some of the more kind of, I don't want to say extreme, but more kind of defined and like specific values and philosophies. I think that when you look at all co-housing communities, if you could sort of generalize and say there's generally people that are interested in sustainability and that people have an interest in diversity and inclusion, even that last part might be controversial for some communities. It really needs to be like, how to broadly appeal to a large group of people, because the more you narrow it down, like I know of communities in my region that were Christian focused groups, or that had a very strong value in a specific other kind of spiritual group or things like that. It's really difficult for funding and for recruitment. Like the banks don't ever want it to be a singular group. Even for senior housing, sometimes it becomes a challenge with lenders. And now that there are some guidelines around it, if you're 55 and older, you can legally have a senior community, but it's really difficult. And when it looks like it's very specific to one sort of viewpoint or demographic, you start to narrow and it becomes less accessible to the broader public. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, Crystal, in the best of worlds, what would be a solution to make this the kind of great diversified form of housing that you would envision?
In the best of worlds, all housing would be free. So like Grace said, co-housing is like the most straight, moderate, so-called normal way of an intentional community. Vanilla, very vanilla. So it's hard to have co-housing break out and be a huge movement if the co-housing communities are based on a philosophy. So it's the way co-housing is just kind of attracts those people who are more moderate, who aren't like looking for like a radical world-changing viewpoint. They just want a place to live. So I don't know if co-housing would be the way to create a really like equitable way for people to be in housing. I think the biggest thing that minority communities face is having that capital to invest in housing, and then having access to credit and things like that. So that's the biggest barrier that I see.
Okay, thank you. All right. Thank you, Victoria.
Thanks, Al. So we have another question. I think we have time for one more question. This is from Dishta. I'm not sure if you want to hop on. I'll read it out loud for you if you like. So in the current condition of the pandemic and the surge of cases, do you think that the demand and to get approvals for co-housing projects would become difficult? So this sort of ties in to a question that Elizabeth had also asked about, I think, how these communities can be resilient in the time of COVID.
I'm just going to jump in for a second here and just to mention one thing that Grace brought up, which I find really compelling, and I've experienced myself in a different way during the pandemic, and that is the question of the choice within the community that your community has made, Grace, in terms of the kind of social connection. So you mentioned the thing about not social distancing, but physical distancing and social connection. I think that's profound, really profound. I appreciate you articulating that, because I think it's critically important. And in terms of mental health and wellness, the idea of social distancing versus the idea of physical distancing and social connection is critically important. And so I think that the idea that buildings, physical environments can be designed in such a way to be resilient and adapt to these kinds of conditions is just fantastic. And certainly in the work that we've been doing and related to co-housing, that's been a thought. And I've also noticed it in terms of, both myself and other people who are living in rural environments where, but relatively close to neighbors, the ability to be able to have social distancing happy hour and that kind of thing, you know, where you can kind of get together and different households are all 10, 15 feet apart, but you can kind of create a circle and you can actually have that social contact and just the casual discussions of your community in a safe way. And obviously that's a choice that people have to make in terms of how that is constituted. And it can't be something that can be legislated because it's a complexity that legislation can't handle. But I think it is something that communities can decide and be entirely safe. And it's going to be different with different communities. So.
Yeah, and to piggyback on what John is saying, I think in the more rural and suburban communities for co-housing, I think it's easier to adapt the way that they are, their physical environment to, so being physically distant. To your point, you can all sit around a common square and put your camping chairs or whatever chairs outside in a big circle. In our case, we don't have that luxury of physical land. We're in a very, very urban environment, and we occupy 4,500 square feet of land. So in Seattle, a 5,000 square foot property is what a single family house sits on. So there are 9 families sitting on this small piece of land. The way that we designed our community specifically to have those outdoor balconies so that we could see each other coming and going, that was a very intentional act that we did. But this time of COVID closures, that has been our relief valve, right? Sit outside in a not enclosed space on our balconies, sitting 6 feet apart from each other and still having conversation, or to overlook the courtyard and have bingo night or music or whatever is happening. Like we're having a big concert on next week. There's a nonprofit fundraiser kind of thing to raise money and for the COVID relief. So somebody's going to set up a big screen and put the speakers out in the courtyard, and we're going to all watch together from our respective balconies. So those kinds of things are important. We're having lots of conversations about that now, of not just co-housing, but in just post-COVID, what are the changes in multifamily housing that are necessary? And I think this idea of private open space is really important. When you're living in a single family home in the suburbs, you have a huge yard at your disposal. If you're living in a more urban area and the public parks that are provided are crowded because everybody is flocking there, then and people have different levels of risk exposure and health concerns, or even mental health. Having that open space that is private and protected, and that in our building we have norms around how we will use those and occupy them and clean up in those spaces. For us, that's been a huge source of connection and mental well-being, as well as just the physical. Like we have some teenagers where the parents are saying you have to be standing outside in the sunlight for 15 minutes a day, right? And so like even that, there's one child that has severe immune compromised system. So for him, he can go up to the crow's nest, and it's a community norm that, that we're going to be very safe around that space so that he can go there, and he also has nut allergies. So just making sure that we are taking care, right? So that because we have these norms and because we have these spaces that we can protect and kind of keep clean in the ways that we need to, we have a lot of autonomy and privilege to occupy the space this way. And this is something that we need to be thinking about in multifamily housing in general, because if it's a developer, and I know lots of developers and nonprofits who are concerned about, do we provide private outdoor space, and the balcony gets junked up with whatever bikes and things, boxes that they don't want to see. So we have seen many developers move away from having private open space and really concentrating on more meaningful gathering spaces. And yet during this COVID closure, all of those public gathering spaces, all the furniture's removed. There's caution tape put out saying you cannot gather here. And so people in those residential communities don't have any place to go. So I feel like there's lots of lessons learned from our own community that I would apply to not only co-housing projects, but future projects moving forward. And it really comes from a standpoint of like getting rid of double loaded corridors, making sure that there's lots of exterior circulation, both from a ventilation standpoint and people, seeing your neighbors coming and going, but also, there's lots of environmental and financial benefits to doing that as well.
Okay, it looks like Dishta turned off her video, but Grace, that was a really thorough answer. Thank you. So we're at 2:14. This is 1 minute before we were going to end our symposium. So I think it's probably great that we stop now. There are quite a few questions we haven't gotten to, but I really want to respect everyone's time. I especially want to thank John and Grace and Crystal and Adrian and Nicole for also organizing this, helping me organize this and sort of moderating the participants. This has been such a great experience. Thanks everybody for coming out. We've had such a good turnout. The recording of the symposium is going to be made available, and I'm also creating a transcript just for accessibility and also for those who've missed it. This is a new platform for us, doing this Zoom symposium. So if anyone has any feedback or suggestions, there are still 3 symposiums to come. And so I'm sure that they would appreciate any of your insights. And on that, I also want to remind you that at the end of June, there's symposium by Vincent Min and Winston Yu, who are calling it Democratizing Design. So more information to follow, but thank you everyone for participating. This has been great.